Hey, media, we need a rewrite. I'm Erin Trafford, and this is The Fourth Draft. Well, hello, welcome into episode 4 of The Fourth Draft. Well, that's rather poetic. I want to start with a little story today. A little story about podcasting. The last few episodes, we talked a lot about media. We were really looking in the rear view mirror. We were considering how we got here, which is something that, a phrase I posed in the trailer for the show. How did we get here? So I figured we needed to spend the first few episodes really unpacking that. But for today, I want to tell you a story about the future. Because, some in my circles would say that I'm a little bit of a psychic or a witch or whatever you want to call me. No, not really. This is something that really happened to me, I want to say about 8 weeks now. And I walked into a conversation and this was the phrase that was uttered. There is zero future for podcasting. Like zero future. So when I think of that, I think of like apocalyptic doom and gloom going in the absolute shitter. And so, when I heard those words uttered, and I should say by a broadcast executive in Canada at a fairly large Canadian broadcast company, a couple of things. The first thing I knew is that it was a knee-jerk reaction. So when people say things that are hyperbolic or whatever, I always know that it's some sort of reaction to an emotional response of some element of fear or discomfort. So I did take it all with a grain of salt. It was a bit of a knee-jerk reaction. And I also think, wholeheartedly believe, in fact, that it is not the belief of many that podcasting has zero future. But it does deserve, this question of future does deserve a little bit of space to address. Because here's what I know is that the future of podcasting does not look like the future of radio, and it does not look like the future of digital media. It doesn't look like the future of anything we have built before, because it's not anything we have built before. So if we're going to be excited about it and lean into it, which, business owners and brands and creators are leaning into this medium with huge numbers, right? Lots of people are leaning in. If we're going to do that, I think it's a good time to have a conversation about what could that future look like, and upon what kind of characteristics are we going to judge the results or create a metric of success, right? So that's what I want to talk about today, is this idea of, sort of podcasting being on the rise, and don't let your future hit you on the way out the door, right? Let's not sort of lose sight of the forest for the trees, trying to compare it to something we've already done, because we've never done anything like this. Never, never, never. I'm Erin Trafford, by the way. Thank you for tuning into The Fourth Draft and making it part of your routine. This is a new show here that I launched a few weeks ago, frankly, off the side of my desk, much to my team's chagrin. But I am the CEO at Story Studio Network, and we are a branded podcast network in Canada. We have teams in Halifax, New Brunswick, and in throughout parts of Ontario, mostly in Toronto. And in the last few months, I also launched a media division of the company called the Echo Community Podcast Network. The missions of both companies are to really bring audio on demand in its highest form to Canadians in ways that best serve them. So Story Studio Network focuses on working with brands and organizations, and getting their messages out using the power of podcasting. And we have an incredible team that works doing that. The Echo Network is about reinvigorating local communities who have lost connection to their local content and local stories by, as a result of either local news organizations shutting down, or radio stations going off the air, or any of those kind of trends that we have seen in the last 10 years or so. So both companies are new, they're startups. And here's what I'm learning too, is that being a woman CEO in the Canadian startup space, let alone the Canadian media startup space, is it's something else, I'll tell you. It's something else. If you have any advice, drop me a note on LinkedIn, or if you would like to chat, or maybe just be a supportive friend, I will gladly accept. It is a challenging landscape. It is a challenging landscape. And as I say that, I'm making notes. So maybe in a couple of weeks, I'll tell you kind of what the challenges have been, because there have been many. There have been many, and I expect there will be more. So that's the context. So let's talk a little bit about this whole podcasting being on the rise, because why did I lean into podcasting? Well, there were a bunch of reasons why I decided to lean into podcasting, but I think these are the reasons why other people are now kind of catching on and moving forward. So to set the stage, I want to say podcasting is a lot of things, but I can tell you with absolute certainty, it's not a direct competitor to any one specific form of media. And here's why. The truth of it is that every media source, whether it's digital, whether it's streaming, whether it's TV, over the air radio, library books, okay, which is technically a form of media, um, we're all just competing for attention. So if you look at it through that lens, it's really hard to justify saying that podcasting is a direct competitor to radio. There are a few deeper comparisons. People tend to listen to audio in the car, and traditionally radio has owned the space in the car, right? Until very recently, when we started to see podcast numbers, in-car listening podcast numbers tick up. But it's nowhere near radio. So radio is still king, queen, jack, 10 of spades in the car. I don't know that it'll stay that way forever, which is why we're talking about the future of podcasting. But, there really isn't a justification for saying that podcasting is a direct threat to radio. So here's what we know to be true. There are 3 things I want to unpack today. And I think we'll probably have to talk about this at length. Like, I'm sure you have questions. And if you do, again, please reach out, hello@storystudionetwork.com, or find me on LinkedIn, Erin Trafford. I'm always game to have a chat in the DMs over there. So I'm going to go through the 3 key things I want to focus on in terms of the future. First is intent. Okay, we're going to talk about intent. Then we're going to talk about how it's best served. And on ice, best served on ice, podcasting. No, okay, how it's best served to the listener. And then also, I want to talk about headspace, because it's kind of a blend of both intent and this idea of being best served. So let's start with intent. Why is podcasting different than radio or television? Traditional television. I'm going to put streaming to the side, because what we're actually seeing is that podcasting is much more like streaming, but again, it's different. Okay. So it's different from Netflix, and it's very different from YouTube. So the way to understand intent is, let's look at the behavior of the listener, where we are when we choose to listen to podcasts. There's some cool research out there that shows that people are actively building their podcast listening into their lives around things they already have to do. Some of the highest listening happens while folks are exercising. So out for a jog, out for a walk, on the treadmill, whatever, even just lifting weights, you've got a podcast in your ears. I love to listen to podcasts while I walk my dog. I listen to podcasts while I do a full house clean, top to tail, because I drown out the noise of the kids, and I just, put my podcast on and do my thing. And that's also a very popular behavior. There are folks who listen to podcasts while cleaning the house and doing other kind of menial errands. So, if you're a parent, you probably know about the Saturday morning hustle, when you're doing the Costco, you're doing the grocery store, you're doing, the tailors or whatever, you're doing that runaround. People are listening to podcasts during those times when they're expecting to hop in and hop out and hop in and hop out of the car. And the reason I'm telling you this is because podcast listening is different than over the air radio listening, where you might sit in the car and flip on the radio, and then what you get is what you get. As my daughter would say, you get what you get, and you don't get upset. You get what you get. And then you're going to flip through the channels if you don't immediately hear something that aligns with you. Whereas when we're looking at behavior linking, or behavior stacking, or habit stacking, as it's been called, you're consciously choosing to listen to that show while doing something else. Maybe listening to the podcast makes cleaning the toilets more enjoyable, right? There's a behavior linkage, and therefore an emotional linkage. And what the research has shown is that actually impacts our absorption rates in a positive way. The neat thing is that we have seen there are huge double-digit percentage lifts in things like brand engagement, retention, recall. And it's because our brains are doing two things at the same time intentionally. It's so cool. I am not a neuroscience. I play one on the podcast, but that is what the research shows. And you don't get that kind of depth with the radio. So there, I would say, not a comparison. There, we're in an apples to oranges situation. So now let's talk about how the content is best served. And what do I mean when I say that? With over the air, traditionally, television, and we can talk about the TiVo thing, but that was a weird time in television. Um, just traditional over the air signals, okay? It is linear by nature. What goes out is what goes out. And if you miss it and you don't connect again on that frequency, you're never going to have known that it happened unless there's a replay later on and you happen to catch that, right? It's a linear experience. If the listener isn't there when the over the air signal is sent, the listener doesn't know what happened. They have no way of rewinding and catching up. That's just the nature of the technology. Podcasts, we see this, are best served and produced, in fact, which is something that we excel at Story Studio Network, in a non-linear fashion. Non-linear, because when given the choice, human beings display a behavior with podcast listening where they don't want to listen to it linearly. They have more control over how they experience your content. They're going to bounce around with intention. So produce your show with that expectation. Expect them to want to replay things. Expect them to maybe hop in on episode, 52, love what they hear, and then go all the way back to episode 1 and do that whole binge thing, which sometimes you can do now on Netflix with, if somebody recommends a show. I don't know why you would do that. Why, if somebody recommends a show, you wouldn't just naturally start on episode 1. So there again is an interesting behaviorism with podcast listeners, is that they don't typically start on episode 1, but if they like what they hear, they will go back to episode 1. So this whole idea of experiencing the content in a nonlinear fashion, I can take it one step further and say that the research shows too that while the producer or the host experiences the show linearly, because I'm producing this every Wednesday morning at my desk and then editing it up and dropping the file. So for me, it feels linear. It's very likely that you are not experiencing my show in any the same way. So you might be listening to this episode 2, 3, 4 weeks after I've experienced it. I've moved on. I'm 4 episodes ahead of you already. And here you are on episode 4. So it's a really kind of nuanced understanding of how podcast content is best served and received. It's very different than traditional radio. And I think that's why it presents a massive opportunity. Again, not competition. And so this last thing that I want to unpack is this concept that kind of blends that intentionality with this best served notion, which I say is about headspace. The listener to a podcast is in a completely different headspace than when they tune into anything else. So, I love listening to podcasts. I just said, when I walk my dog Banjo, I flip on a podcast. I often listen to them actually while I'm getting ready, doing my makeup for the day or whatever. I'll flip it on and put it in the bathroom while I'm getting ready. But I also really, really like watching TV in the evenings with my husband. So we'll stream some late night shows on YouTube. I have a few Netflix shows that he hates that I love. So I'll watch those, like reality TV. I sometimes am a sucker for that. So I'll watch that on Netflix. Every once in a while, we'll, intentionally binge a show together on Prime or Crave. We're huge Star Trek fans. So I also really indulge in those kinds of behaviors, the TV watching behavior. And actually, before I get to that, the other thing that I will sometimes do, and I'm trying very hard not to, is that whole scrolling on Instagram or TikTok. I took TikTok off my phone because I just can't. I just can't with the TikToks. But I do it sometimes on Instagram, is this whole like death scroll thing where you're just like zoned right out and you're just scrolling, and you look up and you've lost like 30 or 40 minutes of your life. So those are the consumption behaviors. And here's what I want you to hear me say is that it's the same person who indulges all three of those different behaviors. I intentionally flip on a podcast when I get ready in the morning or walk the dog. I intentionally sit down with my husband to watch shows on YouTube or to watch something on Prime or Crave or Netflix. I unintentionally open up Instagram and will sit there and just scroll mindlessly. But it's all my behavior, right? So, what I'm calling attention to is that my level of attention, my receptive headspace, my intentionality as a human being shifts and ebbs and flows throughout the day. I will display extremely different behaviors throughout the day. And when I'm listening to a podcast, I am nowhere near the headspace that I'm in when I'm scrolling mindlessly on Instagram. When I'm listening to a podcast, I am not in the, I want to sink into the couch with a glass of Chardonnay and a bowl of popcorn and, hang out with my husband. I'm not in the same state of mind. And the neat thing about podcasts is that it tends to be something done completely solo. 93% of podcast consumers will listen to a show with headphones on, meaning it is an incredibly personal, intentional experience. And I think that there's opportunity there too, because that's what sets it apart from the Netflix and scroll. Because often I'm on the couch with the popcorn and my husband watching Netflix, but I still have my phone. So I'm indulging in scrolling Instagram while also streaming Netflix. That's a very rare behavior when you're listening to a podcast. So there's kind of three layers here: the intention to set the podcast as part of our behavior and our day. How we're receiving that information is very different than any other digital media. And then also, the way that our brains work with intentionality and headspace is that you might have one listener who is fragmented into different types of mindset behavior based on their content consumption. And I think that that is a huge opportunity for us. And it means there's a massive future for podcasting, not that there's zero future for podcasting. There is not zero future for podcasting. So, what I'm going to propose is that we just flip this script right now. If you have been a non-believer, just allow yourself to believe in the future that we get to craft together using all these cool new tools that are out there. The future of podcasting in Canada is far from dim. So let's start talking about how it can be a beacon for old school mainstream media and not a burned out or missed opportunity. That's it for this episode of The Fourth Draft. Thank you so much for tuning in. Remember to rate and review on your podcast player of choice and share the show with folks you think might like it. Also, my contact info in the show notes, a little more detail in the show notes. And as I mentioned all the time, I appreciate a connection over on LinkedIn. And I mentioned that it would soon be a thing, and it is now a thing. So if you want to go deeper on some of this research, we've brought it all together for you. Also in the show notes, you can check out our brand spanking new in-depth guide to branded podcasts. It's a free download, and it is full of cool insights about the industry. Next episode, I'm bringing the team back in for an eavesdrop, and we're going to talk about this cult of celebrity podcasts. Asking the question, is it a good thing or a bad thing? It's certainly a thing. Thanks for listening. Until next week.